Hello, everyone. The Center for Arts and Humanities at AUB has the pleasure to be hosting a lecture by Dr. Sirene Harb entitled Articulations of Resistance in Arab American Poetry. Dr. Harb is Associate Professor in the Department of English at the American University of Beirut, where she teaches American and Comparative Literature. She is also affiliated with the Civilization Studies Program and KZAR. She is currently a fellow at the Center for Arts and Humanities, where she is completing her book project, Strategies of Resistance in Arab American Poetry, Transformative Practices and Articulations, under contract with Routledge. Her research focuses on transnational feminism, cultural and literary resistance, and discourses of solidarity and liberation in post-colonial African American and Arab American literatures. Her publications have appeared in Melis, Journal for Modern Literature, Feminist Formations and Warfare in the American Homeland, Policing and Prison in a Penal Democracy, among others. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Harb today.
Thank you, Rita. Before I start this presentation, I would like to thank the Center for Arts and Humanities for sponsoring this talk and for their support through a faculty fellowship to research and draft sections of my book project, Strategies of Resistance in Arab American Poetry, Transformative Practices and Articulations. This scholarly monograph reflects my research interests centered on the intersections between Arab American literary studies on the one hand and post-colonial, ethnic, and transnational studies on the other. I would also like to thank my colleagues in the English department for, of course, taking the time and making the time to come, but also for many conversations that we've had about topics related to this book. They have been a source of support as well as nurture. Last but not least, I would like to also thank my graduate assistants, past and present, who have helped me research topics for inclusion in this book. This talk is divided into 3 sections. The first provides an overview of my book project and explains the nature of my intervention in the field of Arab American literature. The second briefly introduces the book's chapters, while the third discusses specific examples from one of the chapters in order to illustrate the theoretical links previously introduced. Section 1, introducing the book project and its various parts. In order to situate this project, I would like to first give a brief overview of the development of Arab American literature. Literary historians divide Arab American literature into 3 stages. The first stage, which spans the early part of the 20th century, 1900 to 1940, includes writers from the Mahjar group, such as Amin al-Rihani, Gibran Khalil Gibran, and Mikhail Naimi. These writers, mainly based in New York and strongly influenced by European Romanticism as well as American Transcendentalism, called for innovations in Arabic literature and for the revision of outdated cultural and literary traditions in the Arab world. The second phase of Arab American literature, 1940 to 1970, which saw a decline in literary production, was marked by assimilationist ideologies, which informed approaches to questions of racialization. Major authors of this period, such as Vance Bourjaili, William Peter Blatty, and Eugene Paul Nassar, stressed their Americanness, and they did not see themselves as Arab American. The third stage of Arab American literature, roughly again 1980 till the present, includes writers such as Lisa Sohair Majaj, David Williams, Natalie Handal, and others. This stage is characterized by particular attention to issues of racialization, transnationalism, sexuality, citizenship, and belonging. Although this stage was marked by the maturation of the novel form, it has also witnessed the publication of the most diverse and complex body of Arab American poetry in its history. Despite this proliferation in poetic production, however, The field of literary criticism, as Dennis Ludischer notes, has tended to privilege the study and analysis of fiction at the expense of poetry. In an attempt to redress this imbalance, my book focuses exclusively on contemporary Arab American poetry, a field characterized by complex negotiations of identity, locations, and allegiances. Each poem in this tradition is unique in its focus and negotiations. However, what brings the various poets I discuss together, despite their wide range of topics, is the focus on questions of language, tradition, ethnicity, and memory. In this process, these authors define the position of Arab Americans on the ethnic map of the United States and resist hegemonic formations, colonial mappings, and imperial languages. Probing such notions, my book project proposes the first book-length study of contemporary Arab American poetry to mainly show how it formally and thematically challenges hegemonic formations and power configurations. Located at the intersection of ethnic, post-colonial, and transnational studies, my analysis probes discursive formations and their intervention in the portrayal of history, space, language, and solidarity in contemporary Arab American poetry. Now let's move to slide 2, please. In its focus on poems penned by Arab American writers, so this is the first group of writers included in the book, and let's move now to, thank you, this is the second one. So in its focus on poems penned by Arab American writers, it examines how articulations of resistance to hegemonic formations shape the representation of time, trauma, and solidarity. Resistance is also conveyed through bilingualism and hybrid poetic forms. In the context of this discussion, resistance is defined following Mary D. Shazer as, quote, an active quest for justice and not merely a reactive phenomenon created in response to power and its abuses, unquote. D. Shazer adds, quote, I use the term resistance as an umbrella covering poetry that challenges oppressive governments, policies, and institutions, but often goes beyond mere opposition, end of quote. D. Shazer's definition of resistance encompasses a broad range of phenomena. It also stresses the importance of looking at the role of resistance in generating models of social justice through literature. But what is the importance of examining the role of these specific elements that I previously mentioned, namely language, space, solidarity, and haunting, in generating resistance? What links these specific variables in Arab American poetic production? To answer this question, it is important to remember that language and control over space and/or geography have historically served as tools to impose hegemony and map the world according to hierarchies informing belonging and non-belonging, inclusion and exclusion. Very often, the ways in which languages and spaces become dominant in this hierarchy go through the repression of forms of difference pertaining to other groups as well as their culture and tradition. This repression is mediated by the use of violence as a tool for implementing supremacy and establishing the victor's version of history as the only legitimate one. Such violence, however, does not end when a specific event is officially over and done with. As studies probing the philosophical, psychological, and sociological dimensions of violence show, repressed violence comes back, often in the form of shadows and ghosts, to haunt the present, making the victims' voices heard and disturbing traditional configurations of time and space. Shadows and ghosts are thus signifiers of violence and violations mediated by control over language, space, and history. The representation of shadows and ghosts becomes a site of exploration of how power structures operate. It also uncovers hierarchies and distinctions underlying forms of eligibility and definitions of value. These forms of eligibility do not only inform monolingualism, monoculturalism, and neo-imperialist figurations of time and space, but they are equally embedded in other normative formations, such as minority and bourgeois nationalism. Confrontation with such hegemonic formations results in the articulation of a vision of identity and solidarity characterized by multiplicity and relationality. This vision, as the book argues, challenges binaries such as self-other, inside, outside, us, them, English, Arabic, to produce questions which unveil complex webs of interaction and workings of memory and community. The articulation of these questions mediates transformative practices manifested in the creation of bilingual/multilingual spaces and cross-cultural, poetic, and linguistic structures projecting silenced aspects of the Arab American experience. Let's move to slide 4, please. Thank you. After introducing the focus of the book, I will now be giving an overview of the different chapters that this project focuses, the different themes that this book focuses on. So chapter 1, entitled Haunted Spaces, Ghostliness, Loss, and Violence, examines forms of haunting portrayed in A Letter by Sinan Antoun, Beirut Seizures by Hasm Roué, The Lives of Rain by Nathalie Handal, 19 Varieties of Gazelle and You and Yours by Naomi Shihab Nye, and Geographies of Light by Lisa Souheir Majaj. So these are basically, this is the first group of Arab American authors I focus on. These forms of haunting are associated with tragedies such as the Lebanese Civil War, the Iraq Wars, and the Nakba. Probing eruptions of shadows and apparitions of the dead in these poems, this chapter examines how haunting as a literary strategy articulates a politics of resistance as it challenges notions of closure and effects a critique of linear and progressive imperial time underlying national and colonial narratives. As such, the past, present, and future are depicted as happening at the same time through the figure of the ghost, which deconstructs the opposition pitting past against present and the material and or corporeal against the spiritual and or ephemeral, as Jacques Derrida argues in Spectres of Marx. In the same vein, the ghost undoes what Walter Benjamin calls homogeneous empty time and heralds a critique of the ideal of progress underlying Western teleology and systems of knowledge. Against such ideal, ghosts present alternative and experimental tools for negotiating unfinished narratives and unarticulated losses, as the poems under discussion in this chapter make evident. This chapter also highlights ways in which haunting contributes to the formulation of a poetics of resistance associated with acts of reading and interpretation. Looking at this trope, I argue, provides a starting point for revising the critical mapping of Arab Americanness, since it intervenes in debates around ethnic crossing and diasporic location. The deconstruction of binarisms and the dynamic movement across borders also inspires Arab American writing about 9/11, which is explored in the second chapter of the book. Chapter 2, entitled Translating 9/11, Contrapuntalism, Dialogism, and Necropolitics, probes questions of remembering, translation, and historicization in two categories of poems about the tragedy of 9/11. The first category includes poems produced in the period immediately following 9/11 and penned by Souheir Hamad, Dima Hilal, and Mohja Qahaf, while the second category includes poems published later and authored by Lisa Souheir Majaj and Hayyan Sharara. I show how the early poems use an approach to translation marked by associative remembering as a mode of contrapuntal reading of history, which results in the rearrangement of normative geographies. For the later poems, however, the use of translation mainly relies on the necropolitical and the dialogic to evaluate imperial paradigms, simplistic polarizations of good and evil, and their role in obscuring the ambiguities of political practices. However, both groups of poems, as the chapter shows, contribute to the production of a critically recuperative voice exposing the ambivalence of the location of Arab Americans in the United States. The transformative energies informing such articulations are probed in Chapter 3, Bilingualism, Cultural Foreignization, and Formal Innovation. I will give an overview of this chapter in the next section, since it will be the focus of my analysis. Energies underlying revision and resistance in Arab American poetry are not only inspired by centripetal forces associated with the specificities of struggle relating to the Arab world, questions of racialized Arabness, and complex ties with the ancestral homeland. They are rather powerfully influenced by articulations of resistance in the literature of other ethnic groups and the visions of solidarity, liberation, and justice they convey. As Chapter 4, Centrifugal Forces and Articulations of Resistance, the poetry of June Jordan and Suhair Hamad demonstrates. This influence shows in how Arab American poets recognize the importance of anti-colonial struggles and appeal specifically to ethnic alliances to challenge traditional oppositions between filiation and affiliation. In its exploration of such alliances, this chapter probes centrifugal forces shaping resistance in Arab American writing through a comparative study of the work of Suhair Hamad and African-American teacher, poet, essayist, and activist June Jordan to show how Arab American liberation is not only rooted in Arab American history, but is also the product of various affiliative gestures that Arab American poets make with ethnic liberation figures. In its ability to highlight the importance of the local and the trans-ethnic in relation to liberation discourses and anti-colonial and anti-imperial resistance, Jordan's and Hamad's poetry stresses the significance of the internal dimensions of resistance as well as its global effects. Theorizing such resistance in relation to the work of these poets paves the way for reading Arab American literature from a trans-ethnic perspective by stressing its revolutionary politics, which configures a world of possibilities that work against violent histories of repression and policing targeting ethnic communities. In this context, as this chapter shows, the critique of normative politics and multicultural ideals, the reclamation of marginalized histories, the identification of original links among the oppressed, the creation of alternative structures of belonging, and the affirmation of embodied agency and militant rage articulate a politics of resistance mediating such trans-ethnic and cross-racial affiliations. Now we move to section 3, entitled Bilingualism, Formal Innovation, and Foreignizing References as Strategies of Resistance. This section probes the work of Philip Mitris, Marwa Hilal, and Dima Hilal, three authors analyzed in Chapter 3 of the book, entitled Bilingualism, Cultural Foreignization, and Formal Innovation. Philip Mitris was born in 1970. His father is Lebanese American and his mother is Euro-American. Marwa Hilal was born in Al-Mansoura, Egypt, in 1981. She currently lives and teaches in Brooklyn, New York. Dima Hilal was born in Beirut in 1976, and she was raised in California. In addition to these authors, Chapter 3 explores texts by Suhair Hamad, Natalie Handal, David Williams, and Khalid Matawa, in which different languages, poetic structures, and cultural references are woven in an interanimating fashion. Specifically, this chapter analyzes strategies such as the incorporation of Arabic script and Arabic words and expressions, the inclusion of foreign cultural references pertaining to the Quranic and Islamic tradition, the transformation of the English language through appropriation and abrogation, and the invention of a particular form of poetic writing inspired by Arabic in terms of their role in shaping and expressing multiple forms of resistance to monoculturalism and monolingualism. Throughout this discussion are included reflections on ways in which these issues impact and are impacted by forms of border crossing and translation. Arguably, interconnected aspects of resistance animate the use of such strategies and reflect how Arab American poetry is involved in a movement that focuses our attention on the messy terrain of power and its shifting configurations. This movement, in turn, shapes critical mappings of Arab American poetic articulations to stress the importance of challenging the fixity of borders as sites of normative practices of linguistic and cultural separation. Throughout these negotiations, the poetry analyzed troubles the hegemony of English as an imperial language and expresses tensions between the stasis of cultural heritage and the fluctuations inherent in active cultural self-making. Mediating these revisions and fluctuations, strategies of defamiliarization of the English language and of poetic structure highlight forms of agency which carve imaginative spaces while also expressing alienation. Such forms, to use Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's terms relating to minor literature, enable authors, quote, to express another potential community, to force the means for another consciousness and another sensibility, unquote. If Arab American literature occupies this position of minor literature, as defined by Deleuze and Guattari, to paraphrase Wael Hassan, then it is important to ask how various Arab American authors express such status and probe its different implications. While it remains true that English is the main medium of expression of these poets, this language is juxtaposed in myriad ways and combinations with Arabic words and sometimes words in other languages, such as French and Spanish, signifying marginal location. These juxtapositions, it should be noted, aim to represent the complexity of Arab American identity as a translational process involving racial, gendered, and other variables. It is worth noting in this respect that the creation of resistance spaces relies on elaborating zones of contact and interaction that project complex identities always in flux. These zones show, to use Homi Bhabha's words, ways in which, I quote, the discursive conditions of dominance can be made to function as the grounds of intervention, unquote. Thinking through such interventions necessitates an awareness of ways in which Arab American poems are informed by migratory agency associated with the traversal of, quote, geographical and linguistic boundaries to make apparent the political character of language, migration and or immigration and community, unquote. And this definition of migratory agency is from a book by Michael Dowdy called American Political Poetry in the 21st Century. As Michael Dowdy explains, migratory agency is associated with a movement between languages and the cultural context they evoke. Poems of migratory agency emphasize movements of border crossing belonging to poets who are bilingual or multilingual. In the context of this movement, it's arguable that languages and voices are not the only elements involved. This movement equally involves social, cultural, and formal factors. Because of many elements, including varying levels of proficiency in languages other than English, or specific positions adopted by these authors, poems by the Arab American writers discussed show different levels of integration of other languages or bilingualism. Words from these languages are transliterated into English and or inserted in the text in Arabic script. This dynamic approach, characterizing the works of poets such as Philip Mitras and Dima Hilal, not only contests the fixity of national and imperial structures, but it also, quote, subverts hierarchies whether they be linguistic or cultural, unquote. Stressing the implication of this experimental linguistic mixing in terms of the reader's location and interpretive horizon, Samia Mehriz explains that these texts, quote, in their own right resist and ultimately exclude the monolingual and demand for their readers to be like themselves, in between, at once capable of reading and translating, where translation becomes an integral part of the reading experience. Can you please move to slide 5? Philip Mitras's A Concordance of Leaves, published in 2015, for instance, demands such modes of reading characterized by in-betweenness and dynamism, since it engages multiple spaces and diverse languages and scripts. This poem, as its subtitle informs us, was composed on the occasion of the wedding of the poet's sister in Palestine. In this long poem of 28 pages, The word waraq, written in Arabic script, figures on top of each page like a title, followed by one parenthesis, which is also used to separate different stanzas. These stanzas are composed of 1 or 2 verses, and the parenthesis is sometimes open and sometimes closed. This configuration reveals a preoccupation with the arrangement of physical as well as metaphorical space, which is of particular significance in the context of this poem set in Palestine, an occupied country where borders are highly contested entities. These borders are not only physical, but, as the poet makes clear, they are also emotional and marked by loss and fear. On a different level, the poet and his family negotiate the borders of cultural difference. As outsiders to Palestinian culture, they ask so many questions that they are called the question factory. And basically here we see, this mention in the second verse. The answers to their questions are often provided in the form of direct translations. For instance, the future brother-in-law explains the meaning of words such as اليوم, صديقي, حلوة, شجرة, haram, ismi, and isma by simply providing the English equivalent. In an understated and subtle way, however, the poet also introduces alternative translations of other words. These translations are shaped by the geopolitical realities and colonial contexts of the setting. For instance, Dunum is defined in the poem as, I quote, slowly disappearing land. However, this word, as we all know, has a different literal meaning since it usually refers to a unit of land area representing 1,000 square meters. This strategy complicates issues of equivalence and produces hybrid constructs that have symbolic value since they function on the metatextual level as comments on questions of language and politics. When Arabic infiltrates the poem, it creates a form of opacity that resists the official authority of the English text as well as related civilizational meta-narratives. This eruption of Arabic and let's move to slide 6, please. This eruption of Arabic is particularly significant in light of the 2 poems that immediately precede a concordance of leaves. These poems are entitled Innocents Abroad 1 and Innocents Abroad 2. So basically, this is the first one and this is the second one. They are redacted versions of 2 poems from Mark Twain's The Innocents Abroad, published in 1869. Describing his experience with this book, Philip Metris notes, quote, I learned about this text while researching right-wing Zionist narratives online. Over and over, the same quotations from Twain's text were recycled as evidence that the so-called Holy Land was a desolate backwater full of wastelands and diseased humans, unquote. In this particular section of his essay, Dispatched from the Land of Erasure, Metris is referring to the following passage from chapter 53 in Twain's book. Slide 7, please. I quote, Rags, wretchedness, poverty, and dirt, those signs and symbols that indicate the presence of Muslim rule more surely than the crescent flag itself, abound. Lepers, cripples, the blind, and the idiotic assail you on every hand, and they know but one word of but one language, apparently, the eternal bakshish. To see the number of maimed, malformed, and diseased humanity that throng the holy places and obstruct the gates, one might suppose that the ancient days had come again. End of quote. The vilification of the natives and their animalization are associated with their reduced mastery over language. After all, as Twain says, they know but one language they know but one word of but one language. This stress on deformities and the natives' inferior status highlights the primitive character of Palestine for this writer. The deployment of disabled humanity, whose lower status Twain underlines, becomes a symbol of the failure of Muslim rule. Metris' A Concordance of Leaves in many ways talks back to this narrative as it reimagines and illustrates the complex and multi-layered histories of Palestine and its people. It also delves into questions of othering and conflict through its exploration of the hegemonic structures underlying hierarchies informing notions of value and valuelessness. Metris thus problematizes questions of history and erasure by making visible the manipulative aspect of discourse through his redaction of sections from The Innocents Abroad. And here, can we go back to slide 6, please? Yes, thank you. The result of this process is a powerful poem that focuses on issues of power, knowledge, and the production of discourse. If we put together the non-redacted words from both pages of The Innocents Abroad, we have basically, and this is just part of the poem, we have the following text that emerges. I can easily see I must unlearn a great many things concerning Palestine. I must begin a system of reduction. The evocation of reduction in a redacted poem points to tensions associated with questions of authorship and control over voice. Twain reduces, but Metris redacts. In this act of subversion, Metris reverses the erasure of Palestine by erasing this erasure in Twain's book. From the act of scratching and scraping the Orientalist and vilifying stereotypical representations of Palestine emerges a text that cautions against prepackaged verdicts and seeing with the eyes of homogenizing power. The redacted text engages complex systems of signification. It participates in a call and response fashion in a call and response relationship with a concordance of leaves which celebrates the musicality and polysemy of Arabic, the very same language reviled in Twain's account. Can you move to slide 8, please? Thank you. The spirit of Arabic is explored by another Arab American writer, Marwa Hilal, through her strategic choice of specific structures to convey defamiliarization and reverse, on the visual and mechanical levels, approaches to reading poems penned in English. A recent illustration of this phenomenon is a form Hilal calls the Arabic, in which the usual direction of reading English words from left to right is reversed. Meaning is conveyed only when readers read verses from right to left. This process is counterintuitive for readers in general, but it is more so for monolingual readers of English, as opposed to some other readers who might be familiar with languages that would be read in the same fashion that she prescribes. This radical experimentation with word sequence and cultural orientation of texts is paramount for Hilal, who is the inventor of this form of writing in the context of the Arab American poetic tradition. Hilal's poem to be read from right to left, which was included in her poetry collection, I Am Made to Leave, I Am Made to Return, which was published in 2017, illustrates this form, as can be seen in this example. And if we read it from, as the poet says, it would be, I learned my first language, second CC, native, I am mistaken for, everywhere I go. As opposed to the normative, the usual reading, which would be probably not really comprehensible here, which is language first, my learned I, second CC, for mistaken, my native, go I everywhere. Explaining the form she invented, Hilal says, let's move to slide 9, please. Thank you. I quote, the Arabic is a form that includes an Arabic letter with an Arabic footnote and an Arabic numeral, preferably written right to left, as the Arabic language is, and vehemently rejects you if you try to read it left to right, as we saw in the illustrated example. Of particular importance is the agency Hilal gives this form. Its vehement rejection of resistant readers, as the poet asserts, is associated with a long history of frustration with the process of marginalization reflected in the patronizing attitude of some native English speakers vis-à-vis the poet. As she clarifies in the same footnote, to vehemently reject in this case means to transfer the feeling of every time the poet has heard an English as only language speaker patronizingly utter in some variation the following phrase, oh, so-and-so is English as a second language, as if it was a kind of weakness. No. End of quote. In an interanimating fashion, the form of a poem becomes expressive of resistance in that it contests exclusionary attitudes. It is structured with a specific notion in mind to reproduce distancing from normative paradigms and feelings of rejection. Not unlike Mitris's technique of introducing Arabic script into his poems, Hilal's reversal of the usual order of words in English to mimic how one reads Arabic results in destabilization. This phenomenon aims to critique mechanisms of othering associated with hierarchies of difference and belonging. The Arabic thus transforms our understanding of the role of language and the written word, and fosters alternative modes of awareness of the element involved in processes of border crossing. It has a consistency which is experienced by native speakers of English as fragmentation. These native speakers are thus exposed for a fleeting moment to forms of interrupted discourse which permanently haunt speakers of other languages. Let's move to slide 10, please. Thank you. Sinan Antoun places these speakers' experiences under the sign of breaking and interruptions. As he cogently puts it, I quote, "Although he has mastered Rome's tongue, oh my God, your English is so good. Until further notice, the barbarian can only speak in fragments. His discourse is interrupted, fragmented, and haunted. The barbarian's mind has become a shelter for ghosts, images, faces, and allulations," unquote. The Arabic forces readers, the Arabic, i.e. the form, forces readers to experience such interruptions and fragmentation, and thus to understand forms of perception which are only too familiar to the barbarian, in Antoun's terms. Such interruptions also define the contours of the reader's vision of language and the process of meaning production. In the barbarian's haunted text, the word is thus vested with a strategic role associated with chronicling and shaping power structures as well as discursive resistance. In many ways, this process is based on the politics of inclusion and exclusion underlying patterns of revision. Poem to be read from right to left thus could be understood in line with Geraldine R. Craver's Christevan characterization of bilingualism in Latina poetry as, I quote, "the site of the confrontation between the writer and the ideologies of culture," unquote. Not unlike Latina poets, Hilal, quote, "decenters or displaces these ideologies by using language in unexpected or unaccepted ways," unquote. On another level, the strategy relies on a dialogic approach to reading, since readers have to reconstruct the poem along with the poet. Although the poet's note offers guidance, one tends to read as she is used to, and there are moments of quiet that interrupt the reconstruction and rearrangement of the poem. As such, the Arabic as form initiates a revision of power relationships associated with reader's position. Let's move to slide 11, please. Thank you. The complexities of such relationships are further explored in Dima Hilal's poetry, which probes the tensions between remembering and forgetting in relation to the Arab American immigrant experience. In this context, Quranic references pose a challenge to the amnesia produced by assimilation into American culture. Hilal's poem, Ghafla, The Sin of Forgetfulness, for instance, dramatizes such process by identifying various forms of alienation from ancestral culture and values that some Arab American immigrants and their descendants experience. For these marginalized subjects, estrangement from the self is catalyzed by the circulation of iconic images and cultural symbols of whiteness, such as Barbie, and through the celebration of colonial languages and their legacy. The use of French greeting words, for example, is represented in Ghafla as a form of betrayal of Arabic and its complex layers associated with the Quranic tradition. The Arab American immigrants' amnesia is also reflected in a gradual process of disaffiliation from their culture and from what Hilal calls their brothers and sisters back there, as well as in their detached attitude vis-à-vis wars and violence in the Middle East. Slide 12, please. Thank you. These immigrants' nostalgia thus acquires a superficial character in its fixation on various signifiers distorted through the lens of appropriation, represented in the poem by blonde belly dancers and American versions of hummus. Let's move to slide 13. These elements are often considered, as the poet notes, a substitute for deeper links with the ancestral homeland and its complex social and political realities. Of utmost importance in this context is the poem's title, Ghafla, which uses a central symbol of the Islamic cultural tradition to represent the weakening of intimacy with the ancestral homeland and its realities, represented as a form of negligence, a sin of the soul. In a religious context, this negligence or forgetfulness is understood to be the result of forgetting God's words and separating the self from the divine. As Laila Yastian explains, I quote, literally, the senseless act of denying one's true identity is induced by a deactivation of the senses as conscious instruments of knowledge. She adds, quote, Islam uses the concept ghafla, which means forgetting, to describe this identity theft. Only by strict adherence to the 5 pillars of Islam can the substitute self be annihilated, fana. Sufis deepen the practice of the 5 pillars. For example, prayer or dhikr, which literally means remembrance, is increased from 5 times a day to unceasing prayer. The Sufi extends the prayer, astaghfirullah, I ask forgiveness of God, to mean I ask to be forgiven for my separate existence. For Rumi, ghafla is the sleep that numbs remembrance of self. End of quote. The concept of ghafla is reworked by Hilal into a translational hybrid metaphor as she represents the sin of forgetfulness through the notion of distancing from origins and cultural legacy. In Islam, such forgetfulness is countered by remembrance or dhikr. I quote, their skins and their hearts soften up to the remembrance of Allah. And this is from the Throngs, verse 23. Remembrance of the divine in this respect is also associated with the annihilation of the substitute self, fana. In the context of the poem, the substitute self is shaped by the othering gaze of imperial culture, which operates through processes of racialization to establish hierarchies of value and belonging. According to such hierarchies, Arab American immigrants are marked as racially inferior since they come from, I quote, the East, meaning different, dark, dirty, and are thus ranked lower on the scale of beauty. As they internalize such configurations, they start believing that, quote, Barbie looks better than Shahrazad, unquote. This ghafla is also shaped by detachment from the suffering of the Middle East and its population, as the poem notes. Immigrants who see, quote, brothers and sisters spit up blood and teeth, unquote, convince themselves that they are powerless. They turn away from bruises and broken bodies and broken bones, body counts and funerals, unquote. This attitude, coupled with immersion into the culture of American consumerism and capitalism, is responsible, according to the author, for shaping another dimension of the substitute self, a dimension that feeds off fake cultural products and artifacts and lures Arab American immigrants into internalizing Orientalist ideas about their culture. Ironically, as immigrants become more comfortable with the substitute self, they experience a contamination of memory and taste. In her poem, Hilal calls for remembrance or dhikr through the power of the written word, specifically inspired by Quranic concepts incorporated in the practice of everyday life to recapture, through this process of articulation with difference, connections with the past and the homeland. Such form of remembrance, translated in the language of displacement and exile, presents an alternative to superficial ways of being and seeing. The poem reminds Arab American immigrants through the epistemological and religious framework of ghafla of the importance of reading past and present selves on a deeper level. This process can be achieved by going beyond the lure of what basically Hilal mentions in her poem in relation to belly dancers and hummus, to reconnect with the spirit and people of the homeland through the active choice of tadakkur, or remembering. Only then can immigrants reclaim their role as the link between over there and over here, and use their voices to challenge the reduction of their own people into what Giorgio Agamben terms bare life in a region torn by war, violence, and international greed. In conclusion, the various poems discussed in this talk displaced hegemonic formations through multi-layered spaces of confrontation and translation. Confrontation brings to the fore a different awareness of ways in which the ethnic, minoritarian subject wrestles with the notion of agency in a voice which carries in its various tonalities transnational echoes of histories of exile and displacement. As the poetry of Philip Mitris, Dima Hilal, and Marwa Hilal creatively deploys bilingualism, Quranic cultural references, and experimentation with poetic structure, it destabilizes preconceived notions of form and challenges conventions of the English language. Throughout this process, these poems express tensions emanating not only from multiple belongings, but also from the responsibility to bear witness to the violence of loss, exile, and dispossession. Thank you.
We open the floor to questions. If anyone would like to ask Dr. Harb any question.
I would like to ask a question about the earlier poets or writers, Rihani and Gibran. And how exactly, of course, the situation is very different
Yes.
now, and the politics are different. But I can see sort of many similarities, not necessarily in introducing Arabic into their writing, as much as this resistance factor. Like, Rihani kept mentioning the, necessity of the Arabs to be Arabs even in the States, write in Arabic, to use Arabic, and that's very superficial. I know it's a very superficial sort of comparison between these poets of now and the earlier poets. But do you feel that it's the same line manifested differently because of the different situations or situation, or is it radically different from before? We're talking about 1860 and now 2020, 2015, etc. But as you were giving examples, I kept remembering what Rihani wrote and how he employed language in his writings. So are you going to touch upon that?
Actually, in this particular project, not really, because I deal with contemporary with some reference to earlier poetry. But I mean, this is a point that's very valid. Actually, there are many themes that recur. However, what I would argue is that their treatment stylistically is much more influenced by questions of racialization, whiteness, of color status, issues of gender also than in the earlier poetry. So in this sense, yes, the spirit of resistance is there, especially like if we think about, what these early poets did in terms of revolutionizing, certain traditions of writing Arabic poetry. What they did was to, for instance, write prose poems and somehow offer a totally different approach to using a language against itself in many ways, because the early poetry asked for specific forms actually to be used for it to become valid as poetry. So there is a lot of the spirit of rebellion against, or the spirit of resistance to confining molds is there. Yes, the form is somehow experimented with, but at the same time, I would argue that the preoccupation of these writers with the questions, with the themes and the notions that I mentioned, they make them different in that sense. Yeah. Thank you.
You mentioned when you were discussing your first chapter that you were looking at, among other texts, a letter by Sirene. And so my question has two parts. The first is how much art is in that letter? Is it poetry? How much are you looking at non-poetic texts in your book? Is it only as supplementary text to read the poetry through them, or are you looking at them also as primary text? And the second question was about how exactly you were designating this kind of concurrence of different time zones. But if you could revisit that, what you see as happening through the haunting with this
juxtaposition. Yes. Thank you. So in terms of the genre, actually, a letter is a poem. Okay, so definitely, there's something else that I also did not mention in relation, to the scope of the book, in order not to, develop this too much at the beginning, which is that this scholarship on Arab American literature has also tended to privilege the literature of Arab women, of Arab American women, at the expense, basically, of many other poems and collections that were published by Arab American male writers. So there are many reasons for that. The book develops this. There is the saving brown women from brown men, phenomenon. There is also the idea of readability. They are more readable, in the context of women of color feminism. So in that sense, there is this legibility that happens in conjunction with this. But so a letter, thus, actually is a poem that was penned in order to compare the tragedies of Iraq, actually, to what is considered to be more universal tragedies, like deforestation, like climatic change, and various other forms of loss considered to be universal, and somehow that reach wider audiences than what happens in Iraq. So the poet asks, what about you? Who knows? In many ways, these victims that are unnamed, not basically recognized as such also, they haunt the poem of Anton. So in that sense, there is this this form that is sent to the whole world in the form of a letter, but it is a poem that should have been actually not that should not have been necessary in the first place. Okay, so as such, it is a poem which functions as a letter, and a letter actually which the author wishes would not function as a poem, but it does. So in many ways, he doesn't want actually to have to write this, but there is a necessity to do so. The second question is about haunting.
It's about haunting and what you and talking about time. The question, that I'm interested in, and you brought that idea of time.
Exactly.
And so I would love for you to elaborate on how you're conceiving of the collapse of time that happened.
Okay, actually, I'll just give one example and then move on to the relationship between the different themes and concepts. So in poems like about the Lebanese Civil War, okay, I analyzed specifically a collection of poems called Beirut Seizures by Hasib Mrouwi. Okay, so in this poem there is this phantom presence, this ghostly presence of Sit Marie Rose. Actually, this is a character who has lived through the war, who has really given a lot actually during the times of war, and she was the director of the school for the deaf mutes. Many authors used this figure. The most famous work is by Etel Adnan. It's called Tet Marie Rose, actually, in order to explore the complexities of the Lebanese civil war. So the poet takes or represents Marie Rose as a ghost who still is capable of action, but at the same time is not visible, is there and not there. She has a hand that gives, that embraces children, killed children, but as we know, I mean, they were killed. So in this sense, she is there in the context of death, in the context of presence and absence, since she acts, but she's not materially, there. We cannot see her. So in this sense, when she comes back, when she does not really belong to a particular time frame, i.e. she's not in the past, she's been killed, she should not be there, she should not be intruding on the present, yet she does. This kind of blurring of boundaries is one that is a comment that I read actually as a comment on forms of or as a way of blurring imperial time, which is very much premised on the idea of linearity, on the logic of basically, barbarism belongs somewhere in the negative, and then basically, the progress is about approaching, getting closer and closer to a more positive, rationalistic, linear, way of being. So in this sense, actually, when such divisions are blurred, then there is a problematization of the logic behind these divisions. And basically, this is how haunting, I argue actually, and there are different kinds, this is just one example, but there are different ways of representations, of revisitations. So doors that are closed basically, but we don't know what type of phenomenon is responsible for their closing. This is in a poem by Nathalie Handal called The Doors of Exile. Okay, revisitations by Lisa Suhair Majaj's parents, who have been basically scarred by colonial occupation. So in various ways, actually, time is, the traditional framework of time is challenged for different purposes, actually.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.